Joseph Stalin put a 100,000 ruble bounty on his head. To the Soviet Union, he was the Eagle of the Eastern Front, a monster who destroyed 519 tanks, a battleship, and over 800 vehicles single-handedly. He was shot down 30 times, survived a crash behind enemy lines, and eventually had his leg blown off by a 40-millimeter shell. Most men would take that as a sign to retire. Hans-Ulrich Rudel took it as a challenge. He went back to the cockpit, strapped his prosthetic to the rudder, and kept flying until the very last day of the war. But there is a dark side to this legend that history often hides. How did one man survive 2,530 combat missions when the average pilot didn't survive 20? Today, we look at the most decorated, the most lethal, and the most controversial pilot to ever take to the skies. The Parson's Son and the Siren. By the summer of 1945, the Soviet Union had placed a price on his head that could buy a city. To Stalin, he was the people's enemy number one. To the Red Army, he was a ghost that threw lightning. They called it a death sentence, but for Hans-Ulrich Rudel, death had been chasing him across 2,530 combat missions, and it was consistently losing the race. This is not just the story of a man who destroyed 2,000 targets, or the only person to ever receive Germany's highest military honor. This is the story of a boy who was told he wasn't good enough to fly, and the terrifying machine that became his iron skin. In the quiet town of Konradswaldow, Hans-Ulrich Rudel was an unlikely candidate for the most decorated pilot in history. He was a parson's son raised in a household of scripture, discipline, and modest expectations. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he rarely spoke. While his peers were discovering the rowdy rebellion of adolescence, Hans was obsessed with the limits of the human lungs and legs. He was a mountain climber, a runner, a gymnast. He sought out the thin air of the peaks where the world felt silent. He was a creature of willpower. If his body failed him, he punished it until it obeyed. He didn't have the swagger of the fighter aces. He was cold, calculated, and singularly focused. Rudel wasn't born with wings, he willed them into existence. In 1936, when the call for the new Luftwaffe went out, Rudel didn't join for the glory of the dogfight. He joined because he wanted to see the world from above. But the sky, he would soon learn, does not welcome the mediocre. September 1939, the Blitzkrieg begins. The world watches in horror as the German war machine tears through Poland. But as the smoke rises over Warsaw, Hans-Ulrich Rudel is nowhere near the cockpit of a bomber. To his commanders, Rudel was a liability. During flight training, his performance in the dive bomber schools was nothing short of disastrous. He was clumsy with the controls. He struggled with the terrifying physics of the vertical plunge. He was deemed unsuited for combat duty and relegated to a long-range reconnaissance squadron. While his comrades were winning Iron Crosses in the clouds, the greatest tank killer of the century was sitting in a muddy tent, filing reports and flying boring observation laps. He was grounded by his own incompetence. The man who would eventually sink a battleship was, at the start of the war, considered too poor a pilot to drop a single bomb on a stationary target. But Rudel possessed a trait his instructors underestimated, a terrifying, almost pathological persistence. Every hour he spent grounded, he spent studying the mechanics of the dive. He flew the missions in his mind, over and over, until the metal felt like bone and the fuel felt like blood. To understand Rudel, you must understand his shadow, the Junkers U-87, the Sturzkampfflugzeug, the Stuka. It was not a graceful machine. It was a fixed-gear, jagged-edged monster designed for one purpose: surgical destruction. It was a flying artillery piece.
While other planes sought the safety of the horizon, the Stuka lived in the vertical. It would climb to the heavens, roll onto its back, and scream straight down at the earth at 600 kilometers per hour. Under the wings sat the Jericho Jarrett, the Jericho trumpets. These were small, wind-driven sirens. They served no tactical purpose in the explosion. They were purely psychological. They were designed to shatter the nerves of the men below. The scream of the Stuka became the soundtrack of the Blitzkrieg. It was the sound of inevitable death. If you heard the siren, the bomb was already intended for you. It was the howl of a predator that didn't need to hide. It wanted you to know it was coming. It wanted you to freeze. The Stuka required a pilot with a heart of stone. When the plane pulled out of a dive, the pilot would endure 6 Gs of force. Blood would drain from the brain. Vision would go black. The Stuka featured an automated recovery system because Junkers knew that more often than not, the pilot would be unconscious as the plane leveled off. For most, the Stuka was a terrifying cage. For Rudel, it was the only place he truly felt alive. By 1941, the war had changed. The easy victories of the West were over. Germany was turning its eyes toward the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was looming. Rudel had finally fought his way back into a dive-bombing unit through sheer, stubborn refusal to be ignored. He had practiced until his hands bled. He had mastered the feeling of the drop. He was no longer the parson's son who liked sports. He had become a precision instrument. The Steel Eagle was about to meet the Russian winter. Stalin had no idea that a man the Luftwaffe once tried to ground was about to become the single most destructive force in the history of aerial warfare. The siren was winding up. The dive was about to begin.
The Vertical Gamble. September 21, 1941. The German Army Group North is strangling Leningrad, but the city refuses to die. From the sanctuary of the Kronstadt harbor, a giant is screaming. The Soviet battleship Marat. 12-inch guns, massive 55,000-ton displacement. A floating mountain of Krupp steel that can hurl a shell the size of a sedan 20 miles into the German lines. It isn't just a ship, it is a long-range executioner. And around it, the Soviets have built a forest of fire. Kronstadt was the most heavily defended naval base on Earth. To fly into its airspace was to sign your own death warrant. Other pilots had tried. They had dropped their payloads into the boiling sea, turned back by a wall of lead that seemed physically impassable. But in the cockpit of a lone J-87, Hans-Ulrich Rudel was looking at the Marat and seeing something the others didn't. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for the exact center of the bullseye. The standard payload for a Stuka was 250 or 500 kilograms. That was what the wings were stressed for. That was what the engine could lift. But Rudel knew the Marat's deck armor would laugh at a 500-kilo hit. He made a choice that bordered on insanity. He ordered a 1,000-kilogram bomb, a literal ton of high explosives, strapped to his fuselage. The plane was dangerously tail-heavy. The takeoff roll consumed every inch of the dirt runway. The Stuka wallowed in the air like a wounded bird, struggling for altitude. His flight lead warned him, if he tried to dive with that weight, the wings might simply snap off when he tried to pull out. If he hit the release too late, the blast would vaporize his own aircraft. Rudel didn't argue. He just climbed. 12,000 feet. The air is thin. The vibration of the Jumo engine rattles Rudel's teeth. 10,000 feet. The Soviet gunners find the range.
The plane shudders as shrapnel tears through the fabric of the rudder. Rudel reaches for the dive brake lever. He doesn't look at his instruments anymore. He looks through the floor window between his feet. There she is, the Marat. He rolls the plane onto its back. The world flips. The sky is gone. There is only the gray water and the smoking barrels of the Soviet guns. Gravity becomes an enemy. The air screams over the wings. The airspeed indicator needles spin into the red. 400, 500, 600 kilometers per hour. The G-forces pin him into the seat. His internal organs feel like they're being crushed against his spine. His vision begins to tunnel. The edges of the world go black. This is where the automatic pull-out mechanism is supposed to take over. This is where the machine is supposed to save the man. Rudel overrides it. 2,000 feet, still diving. 1,500 feet. The flak is so thick he could walk on it. 1,000 feet. His wingman screams over the radio, "Pull up, Hans, pull up!" Rudel waits. He needs to see the rivets on the turret. He needs to be so close that the bomb has no choice but to find the heart of the ship. 300 meters. Clack of the mechanical release. The ton of steel leaves the rack. The Stuka, suddenly lightened, jerks upward like a released spring. But Rudel isn't out of danger. He is now flying directly into the path of his own destruction. The bomb finds the forward magazine. 2,000 shells stored in the dark. The explosion is so violent it creates its own weather. A shock wave of superheated air slams into Rudel's Stuka, tossing it like a leaf in a hurricane. He is flying through a rain of jagged steel. Parts of the ship's superstructure are being blown higher than his aircraft. He pulls until the wings groan and the rivets start to pop. The G-meter hits 6, then 7. Blackness. Total, silent blackness. For 5 seconds, the most dangerous pilot in the world is unconscious, flying a shredded airplane 50 feet above a burning sea. When Rudel's eyes fluttered open, he was skimming the waves, the salt spray hitting his canopy. Behind him, the Marat was a funeral pyre for 1,000 Soviet sailors. He didn't cheer, he didn't pump his fist. He checked his gauges, leveled his wings, and pointed his nose toward base. When he landed, the ground crews fell silent. They looked at the empty bomb rack, then at the shredded tail of his Junkers. They realized then that they weren't looking at a man who followed the rules of engagement. They were looking at a force of nature. In one dive, the parson's son from Silesia had redefined what a single pilot could achieve. The high command stopped seeing him as a wild card. They began to see him as a strategic asset. Hans-Ulrich Rudel had found his calling, and the Soviet Union had found its nightmare. The Flying Scalpel. 1943. The Eastern Front is no longer a war of maneuver. It is a war of attrition. It is a steel tide. From the Ural Mountains, the Soviet Union is screaming, and the scream sounds like the clattering tracks of 10,000 T-34 tanks. The German sledgehammer, the 1,000-kilogram bomb, is failing. It is too slow to prepare, too imprecise for a moving target, and too heavy for the constant, shifting chaos of the front. The Luftwaffe needs a scalpel. They need a way to reach out and touch the heart of a tank from the sky. They need the Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird. On paper, the Ju-87G was an engineering disaster. It was an aerodynamic nightmare. You take an airplane already criticized for being too slow, and you strap 2 800-pound cannons to its wings. It flew like a brick tied to a kite. The drag was immense. The top speed dropped to a crawl. But the real danger was the physics of the kill. Each cannon carried only 6 rounds, and the recoil? The recoil was a physical assault.
His tactic was a dance with death. He would bring the Stuka down to treetop level, so low his wheels would graze the sunflowers. He would slip behind the Soviet line, coming up from the rear where the air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust. He wouldn't dive, he would skim. He would wait until he could see the heat shimmering off the Soviet engine decks. Then, and only then, he would squeeze the triggers. Firing both guns simultaneously was like hitting a wall at 200 miles per hour. If the pilot didn't balance the triggers perfectly, the asymmetrical kick would spin the plane into a terminal stall. For a novice, the Kanonenvogel was a sophisticated way to commit suicide. For Rudel, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Rudel was a hunter, and a hunter knows the anatomy of his prey. He knew he couldn't kill a T-34 from the front. The 37mm shells would simply shatter against the sloped glacis. He had to be surgical. He had to be a ghost.
July 1943. Kursk, the largest tank battle in the history of mankind. Rudel is in the air before dawn. Boom, boom. The shells leave the muzzles at 800 meters per second. The Stuka groans. The shells strike the rear deck of the lead tank. He doesn't watch the fire. He's already banking. Pedal down, stick hard left, G-forces clawing at his face. Another target. Boom, boom. Another turret flies. Boom, boom. A fuel truck vanishes in a fireball. Boom, boom. A heavy KV-1 tank is gutted from behind. By the time the sun set over the blood-soaked fields of Kursk, Hans-Ulrich Rudel had personally accounted for 12 Soviet tanks in one day. One man, one slow, ugly airplane. He had done more damage to the Soviet Armored Corps than an entire regiment of panzers. In the Luftwaffe, the aces were rock stars. They toasted their victories with cognac and champagne. They wore silk scarves and lived for the adrenaline. Not Rudel. The Soviet crews began to recognize his plane. They saw the Kanonenvogel with the yellow wingtips, and they knew. They didn't call him a pilot. They called him Chernaya Smert, the Black Death. While his engine cooled, Rudel sat in the grass and drank a glass of fresh milk. He was a teetotaler, a fitness fanatic, a machine of habit. He didn't celebrate. He checked his stopwatch. He analyzed the trajectory of his shots. He looked for ways to shave half a second off his turnaround time. He was a monk of the cockpit. His religion was precision. His prayer was the recoil of the 37mm gun. The Kremlin was losing patience. One man was stalling entire offensive thrusts. Stalin issued a directive: destroy the Stuka pilot with the cannons at all costs. Entire fighter regiments, the Red Banner elites, were redirected from the front lines with one single objective: find Rudel, shoot him down, bring back his head. They threw waves of steel at him. They ambushed him at his airfields. They filled the air with lead whenever his engine was heard. But Rudel wasn't just a pilot anymore. He had become a ghost. He used the terrain like a cloak. He used the recoil of his own guns to maneuver. He was becoming something more than a soldier. He was becoming a legend that the Soviet Union couldn't kill and Germany couldn't believe. The Steel Eagle was flying into the teeth of a storm, and he was smiling.
The Earth and the Ice. In the cockpit, Hans-Ulrich Rudel was a god of the heights, but the Russian Earth is a jealous thing. It waits for the moment the sky lets go. March 1944, near the Dniester River. Rudel had watched a comrade go down, a young crew stranded in a sea of Soviet-held territory. Against every standing order, against the frantic protests of his own rear gunner, Erwin Henschel, Rudel did the unthinkable. He brought his Stuka down. He landed to save 2 men. He ended up losing everything. The mud, the Rasputitsa, didn't just stop the wheels, it anchored them. As the engine died, the realization set in like a cold fever. The most hunted man in the Soviet Union was no longer a bird of prey. He was grounded. He was bait. The man who ruled the skies was now a beggar on the earth. They ran. Not for minutes, but for hours, then days. 60 kilometers of frozen mud and jagged forests lay between them and the German lines. Behind them, the Red Army wasn't just pursuing, they were sport hunting. They knew who was leading this small pack of fugitives. The physical toll was a different kind of agony than the G-forces of a dive. This was the slow, rhythmic burning of the lungs, the blisters that burst and bled into socks. Rudel, the athlete, the mountain climber, led the way, but even his iron will was fraying. They moved by night, shivering in haystacks by day, listening to the crunch of Soviet boots just inches from their hiding spots. Every snap of a twig was a heartbeat skipped. Every distant bark of a dog was a death sentence. They reached the Dniester River, 600 meters of liquid ice. There were no boats, no bridges, only the black swirling maw of the water and the Soviet patrols closing the circle behind them. Rudel looked at his men. They were hollowed out, gray-faced, shivering with the early stages of hypothermia. There was no choice. To stay was to be captured and paraded through Moscow in a cage. To swim was a gamble with the abyss. The water didn't just feel cold, it felt like fire. It stripped the air from their lungs instantly. Rudel struck out, his powerful swimmer's stroke cutting through the slush. Beside him was Erwin Henschel, his friend, his rear gunner, the man who had watched his back through thousands of hours of combat.
Halfway across, the river began to win. The cold shuts down the muscles. It turns the blood to sludge. Rudel heard a gasp, not a cry for help, but the sound of a man who has simply run out of soul. Henschel didn't scream, he just stopped. His strength vanished into the dark current. Rudel turned, treading water, reaching out, but the Dniester is a thief that doesn't negotiate. The man who had survived 1,000 anti-aircraft batteries was gone in a heartbeat, swallowed by the silence of the Russian winter. Rudel was alone in the white-hot pain of the river. He wanted to dive, to find him, but the current was an iron hand pushing him toward the far bank. He had to live. He had to make the death of his friend mean something. He reached the other side, but the ordeal was only beginning. He was soaking wet in sub-zero temperatures. His boots were gone, lost to the mud of the riverbed. He was barefoot, bleeding, and still 30 miles from safety. He walked until his feet were no longer parts of his body, but blocks of numb, raw meat. At one point, a partisan spotted him. A rifle cracked. A bullet tore through Rudel's shoulder. He didn't fall. He didn't even slow down. He simply kept walking, a barefoot ghost haunted by the image of Henschel's disappearing hand. He was no longer a soldier of the Reich. He was a primal force of survival. He ate raw bark. He drank melted snow. He moved with a singular, rhythmic madness toward the west. When the sentry at the 1st Panzer Division outpost saw him, he raised his rifle. He saw a beggar, a madman, a corpse that refused to lie down. "Halt! Who goes there?" "Rudel, Stuka Wing 2. The news had already gone out. The great Rudel was dead, sunk in the mud, drowned in the river. But when the door opened and that limping, broken figure stood in the light, the silence didn't break. It shattered. They didn't see a hero. They saw a man who had climbed out of the grave. He had survived the 60-kilometer chase. He had survived the bullet and the ice. But as he sat there, the weight of the sky felt heavier than it ever had before. He had come back, but Erwin Henschel was still in the river. Within 48 hours, despite his frozen feet, despite the hole in his shoulder, Rudel demanded to be put back in a cockpit. The Soviets thought they had killed the eagle. They had only made him vengeful.
The One-Legged Eagle. By February 1945, the war was no longer about victory. It was about delaying the inevitable. The Soviet steamroller was breathing down the neck of Berlin. For Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the mission had become a repetitive, desperate cycle. Take off, kill tanks, land, rearm, repeat. He was flying 13, 14, 15 sorties a day. He was a ghost in a machine, fueled by nothing but adrenaline and the grim determination to hold the line for one more hour. But even for a legend, the law of averages is a ruthless hunter. It wasn't a fighter pilot that got him. It was a 40mm anti-aircraft shell, a heavy, jagged piece of Soviet iron that punched through the floor of the cockpit like it was made of paper. The pain wasn't immediate. It was a cold, numbing shock. Rudel looked down and saw a ruin where his right leg used to be. The cockpit was painted in a terrifying, vivid crimson. The controls went slack. The nose of the Stuka dipped toward the icy waters of the Oder. His observer, Ernst Gotterman, a doctor by trade, was screaming through the intercom, his voice a jagged edge of panic and command. Rudel was slipping into the gray. The blood loss was a vacuum, pulling his consciousness out of his body. But Gotterman wouldn't let him die. He gripped Rudel's shoulders from the rear seat, shaking him, yelling over the roar of the wind through the broken canopy. Through sheer, agonizing willpower, Rudel gripped the stick. He used his left foot to jam the rudder. He brought the broken bird down in a controlled crash landing behind German lines, the last thing he saw being the white snow turning red. The surgeons worked by flashlight in a basement near the front. There was no time for finesse. The bone was shattered beyond repair. To save the man, they had to take the leg. The Red Army had finally taken a piece of the eagle, but they hadn't taken his spirit. When Rudel woke from the haze of ether and pain, he didn't ask about his medal or his career. He looked at the stump of his right leg, then looked at Gotterman. He asked how soon they could get him a prosthetic. He wasn't mourning a limb, he was calculating his return to the cockpit. The wound was still raw, the stitches were fresh. Any other man would have been in a convalescent home in the mountains. Rudel was back at the airfield.
He couldn't feel the plane anymore. He had to learn to fly by sight and by the vibration in his hips. He ordered the mechanics to modify the controls, creating a harness for his stump so he could pull the rudder back as well as push it. He was an amputee flying a vintage dive bomber against the most advanced Soviet Yak and L-7 fighters in the world. It was suicide. It was magnificent. It was madness. In the twilight of the Reich, Hitler summoned his favorite soldier to the tomb beneath Berlin. The Führer had run out of territory, run out of armies, and run out of medals. For the man who had destroyed over 500 tanks, a battleship, and a cruiser, the existing honors were no longer enough. The golden oak leaves with swords and diamonds. Out of 18 million men who served in the German armed forces, only one would ever wear it: Hans-Ulrich Rudel. Hitler ordered him to stop flying. He wanted to preserve the legend as a symbol for the new Germany he still believed would rise from the ashes. Rudel looked the dictator in the eye and gave him an ultimatum: I will accept the honor only if I am allowed to keep flying with my wing. Hitler, desperate for even a shred of Rudel's defiance, relented. April 1945. The world is ending. The air is thick with the debris of a civilization. Rudel is back in the sky, his prosthetic leg jammed into its steel stirrup. He is in constant, throbbing pain. Every time he pulls a high G turn, the stump bleeds into his flight suit. He is flying a plane that belongs in a museum against a tide of red steel that covers the earth. He is fighting for a cause that is already dead, for a city that is being ground into dust.
He wasn't fighting for the party anymore. He wasn't even fighting for the Führer. He was fighting because the sky was the only place where he was still whole. He would fly until the fuel ran out or the world stopped turning.
The unrepentant ghost. The 1,000-year Reich ended in 12. As the shadow of the Red Army fell over the ruins of Berlin, Hans-Ulrich Rudel made his final tactical decision. He would not die in a bunker, and he would not rot in a Siberian gulag. He gathered the remnants of his wing. They took to the sky one last time, flying so low the props kicked up dust from the German hills. Their destination? Kitzingen, an airfield now held by the Americans. He destroyed his aircraft in the surrender, a final act of defiance. He stepped out of the wreckage on his prosthetic leg, brushed the dust from his uniform, and adjusted his golden oak leaves. He didn't look like a defeated soldier. He looked like a man who had come to negotiate a peace treaty between equals. The Americans were fascinated and repelled. They expected a broken man, a warrior humbled by the collapse of his ideology. Instead, they found an aristocrat of the air who was chillingly arrogant. Rudel didn't ask for mercy, he demanded respect. He refused to speak to anyone below the rank of colonel. He criticized the Americans' tactical use of air power. He spoke of the Soviets not as men, but as a tide that only he knew how to stem. Even in a prisoner of war camp, he maintained a rigid athletic regimen, hopping on one leg to keep his stump conditioned. He was a man who refused to acknowledge that the world had moved on without him. Post-war Germany had no place for a living symbol of the Luftwaffe. In 1948, Rudel escaped to Argentina. Under the protection of Juan Perón, the Steel Eagle found a new nest. He became a consultant for the infant Argentine aircraft industry. He climbed the Andes on his prosthetic leg. He swam, he skied, and he wrote. But his most enduring post-war contribution wasn't to the South, but back to the West. Decades later, when the United States began developing a dedicated tank killer, the A-10 Warthog, the ghost of the Stuka was in the room. Designers studied Rudel's memoirs. They analyzed his rear armor tactics. They took the DNA of the Kanonenvogel, the slow speed, the heavy armor, the massive nose-mounted gun, and perfected it for the Cold War. The man may have been a pariah, but his lethality was a science that the world was not yet ready to discard. This is where the cinematic hero meets the historical villain. Hans-Ulrich Rudel was not a man of regret. He remained an unrepentant, vocal Nazi sympathizer until his final breath. He supported neo-Nazi groups and never distanced himself from the genocidal regime he served. He never apologized, he never blinked. To Rudel, the war wasn't a moral catastrophe. It was a job he had performed better than anyone else on Earth. He was a man of total, terrifying consistency. He believed in the strength of the will, the purity of the athlete, and the superiority of the German soldier. He was the living embodiment of the warrior myth, divorced from the reality of the Holocaust and the suffering of the millions his bombs helped silence. When Rudel died in 1982, his funeral became a national scandal. 2 active-duty fighter jets flew low over the ceremony. The government claimed it was a coincidence, but the world knew. Even in death, Rudel commanded the sky. Even in a new democracy, the shadow of the eagle was long. How do we judge a man like Hans-Ulrich Rudel? Do we measure him by the 519 tanks he turned to scrap? By the 2,530 times he defied the laws of probability? Or do we measure him by the cause he refused to abandon, even after the world had seen the horrors of the camps?